it was clear to me that there's something psychological about African descent people deeply rooted in our souls, in our systems, as black people, in terms of its cultural content, its spirituality. No matter where we are on planet Earth, there's this Africanity within us. So I wanted to capture that as a part of understanding the motivational system behind African American behavior. Invented this construct called African self-extension orientation. I was trying to refer to this elasticity, this fluidity of the African spirit, how it moves at a spiritual level, and how this energy in African people is always trying to extend itself beyond the physical boundaries of the individual to connect with other individuals or the collective of individuals. And so it had to have a genetic property in my thinking because it was something that was fundamental to African descent people. I thought this construct sort of best captured that idea, and so I call it African self-extension orientation. The second construct in the model called African self-consciousness, I saw as necessary to explain what I call the efficacious functioning in a more African-centered way of the motivation in African American behavior. This requires some level of input from social experience to direct this Africanity, this spirituality, in a way that it's empowering for the individual and the African collective. So these two key constructs, African self-extension orientation and African self-consciousness, became the core of my thinking about the African American personality. That's the basic core of the model that I was trying to articulate and capture as a way of understanding what should we conceive of as the normal way, the normal natural way that African people would function. A third aspect of the theory was to explain abnormality, deviance in our behavior. If we look at this basic model of normalcy and naturalness, we find that it's elusive in our people, again, because of many of these interfering factors that I've just mentioned. So I introduced this construct called cultural misorientation to provide a paradigm that speaks to contemporary African American behavior, given the reality of contemporary African behavior, in terms of the manifestations of the trauma that we see in almost every aspect of our existence. And cultural misorientation essentially means the internalization of a European worldview or European consciousness in African descent people, which leads them to approach life, to approach adaptability in the world from the basis of a Eurocentric conception of that universe. This is not something that just comes to black people. We already articulated what we think is natural and normal about black people. This is really the outcome of the traumatization process of European oppression of African people. They impose this Eurocentric cognitive structure on African people through all institutions, education, religion, you name it. And in so doing, we approach the world as a black-skinned European. And that's the basic nature of what I mean by cultural misorientation. We have internalized an incorrect cultural orientation. It leads us to engage in behaviors that are maladaptive for an African person in terms of these behaviors. While they may lead to accommodation with the reality and environment that we're in, they don't lead to African empowerment. They don't even lead to empowerment of the African reality. And African self-consciousness, core of our personality, because it is socialized, is vulnerable to cultural modification. So it can be modified from its natural state by the institutional bombardment of Eurocentrism. And so what happens is that we develop an alien self-consciousness that's sort of superimposed upon our natural African self-consciousness. And if our natural African self-consciousness is not being reinforced through socialization structures that are natural to African-centered reality, what we have is something similar to what W.B. Du Bois talked about in his dual consciousness construct. Two forces, these two motivational forces, one Eurocentric and one African-centered. And because the African-centered one is not being reinforced, not being nurtured, it becomes weaker, severely weakened, and the Eurocentric one it dominates the system. And so that's what I articulate is going on inside the mindset of the African person under conditions of cultural misorientation. So that's the basic gist of the model. Of course, it began to speak to how we acquire the cultural misorientation, what are the processes in child development, and whether one of my colleagues, Bob Williams, talked about in his work, brilliant idea about, looking at the kind of socialization paths that are available to African personalities at a young developmental age, and how there's a choice here, and of course one that's institutionalized by the mainstream society, Eurocentric society. That's the Eurocentric developmental path, which I call the default path of personality development in European societies, and the African-centered path, which is to the best of the African American community's ability to try to create those nurturing kind of experiences that foster, an African-centered empowerment in spite of the dominance and legitimacy of the Eurocentric institutions. And so we acquire this cultural misorientation through the cultural misoriented systems that may exist surrounding individual African Americans. That literally means where we have black teachers, who are Eurocentric in their orientation, or who are culturally misoriented themselves, black parents who are culturally misoriented themselves, or one parent, and whatever the complexity of the sociological arrangement that may exist there. Other institutions in the immediately surrounding, or what we call generalized significant other kind of institutions in our community, that are Eurocentric in their orientation, and so that means they contribute to the acquisition of this cultural misorientation mindset in African children as we develop in America on the conditions of integration in particular, and so those are some of the developmental implications of this particular model in terms of how do we arrive at that. And of course, once we understand the nature of a problem, if we explain it fully enough, then it certainly gives us suggestions as to what we should attack, how we should attack it if we're going to change it and modify it and correct it. And so so of course we know then the target is how do we recreate an infrastructure in the African American community that speaks to African American empowerment, that African centeredness. And so, of course, it suggests that if a problem is there's a Eurocentric mindset and orientation that's prevalent in the African American community, or this condition of cultural misorientation, then how do we alter this, so that we can create more African-centered orientations in our institutions, in parenting, schools, et cetera, that can foster the empowerment of the natural potential in our people, that is African self-consciousness potential in our people. And of course, that requires a great deal more effort because we don't have the institutional legitimacy in American society for African-centered institutions, and so they have to create their own base of legitimacy, and that's quite a challenge in terms of material and psychological and sociological resources that encompass upon us to be able to garner in order to empower those institutions. So it's a challenge to recover from cultural misorientation, and it's such a pervasive condition among our people because we can't escape the institutions. And to the degree that the Afrocentrism movement in American society that was popular a few years back and gained a lot of notoriety through the national media, to the degree that we can begin to give greater content and substance to that in terms of create a more broad-based institutional infrastructure that has this African-centered content. That's the degree to which we will be able to restore this normalcy, this system of normalcy, this psychodynamic of normalcy within the African personality, the African American personality.